if we had more time, we would just fill it with more things to do, right?
Right.
So the problem is not that we don't have enough time. I think the problem is that we have lost sight of the ancient wisdom that's rooted in rest. Sabbath is a gift from the Creator because it prolongs our life. It brings us sanity and wholeness. It also enriches our relationships and it increases our fruitfulness. Sabbath is not what we do once we've completed all our tasks. We rest right in the middle of all our tasks, and we rest without excuse and without guilt.
Welcome to the Betrayal Recovery Transformation Podcast, where we talk about all things betrayal, all things recovery, and all things transformation. And boy, do we have another transformational conversation ready for you today. I'm your host, Chris Rocha, and I'm here with my steady anchor and co-host, Jen Howie. Hi, sweet sister.
Hi, sweet sister. Steady anchor.
Mm.
Wow. The first thing that came to mind was the movie Anchorman, which I actually haven't seen yet. But then I switched over to probably what you meant, which was more metaphorical in the sense of the anchor, a real anchor.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That is quite a compliment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I am grateful for you, Jen.
So good. I'm grateful for you too, Chris. I'm really excited for today. I'm literally like on the edge of my seat. I probably look a little sideways right now, kind of maybe even a little crazy, because I am so on fire right now for the Lord. I am so on fire for his authority in our lives. And I, it's kind of like the hide it under a bushel no moment. Let's do this. Let's get into today's podcast. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, today we have our returning guest, Dr. Laura Sanger, and Dr. Laura's episode, it's episode 15 about tearing down generational curses and breaking strongholds, is absolutely by far our listener favorite. And I've asked the Lord, why? What is this about? And I just know that people are so hungry for generational freedom and for biblical truth and for the keys that will unlock the chains that we're bound in. And Dr. Laura has been gifted in so many ways. She is one of my favorite theological teachers. And so with that, Dr. Laura, welcome to the podcast again. Thank you for being with us. We are so grateful for you. And we are so excited to hear what the Lord has for all of us today that is going to take us even a step further from episode 15.
Yeah, I mean, I am just so excited to be with you again.
I'm excited.
Yes. Take it away.
Well, I wanted to talk about, I think, in this season of, I don't know when you'll post this, but we are in the month of December. And December for a lot of people can be a very hectic, busy, stress-filled month for various reasons. So I wanted to talk about how do we enter into rest. But before I do that, you wanted me to share with people where to find me. And I can give people a little bit of update as to some of the work that I've been doing. So first of all, you can find me on my website, which is nolongerenslaved.com. I also am on YouTube and Rumble. I have, I think, 41 episodes now on YouTube, and that's No Longer Enslaved. And then if people want to follow me on social media, I'm on Instagram and Telegram as Laura Sanger 444 Hertz. So since we last met, I published another book called Generation Hoodwinked, which I'm very excited about. And I thought I would share just briefly kind of what led me to write that book, because I think it's so important for the work that you guys are doing, especially with your audience that are coming out of places of betrayal and are looking to be transformed. So, Generation Hoodwinked, it was birthed both out of a dream and a vision. So just to give your audience a little bit of context, my first book, The Roots of the Federal Reserve, it was published in November of 2020. So May of that year, I had a dream. And this was before I knew who my publisher was going to be. And in this dream, I had a publisher come to me and say, if you will write a book about how AI has stolen the vocal cords of our children, I'll publish it. And then about 5 months later, I had a vision. And this was while I was awake. Jesus came to me and he took me by the hand And we walked down this dirt path, and he took me to this underground cave at the base of a mountain. And he took me inside this large, dark cavern. And then he released his breath, and it kind of billowed out like this blue light. And so it lit up the cavern. And I could see that there were children in cages lining the walls of this cavern, and they were plugged into the walls. No sound was coming from the children. And so Jesus looked at me and he said, "Take the key of David and go unlock the cages." And so I did, and I unplugged them from the walls. And many of the children ran to the arms of Jesus, but there were some that stayed in the cages. And I knew it was because they were programmed to stay. Well, then Jesus said, "Take your sword and demolish the cages." So while I'm having this vision, the Holy Spirit is giving me revelation that the lockdowns, because this vision was on October 10th, 2020. And so the Holy Spirit was showing me that the lockdowns and the school closures, what they did is they forced our children onto their devices, for social interaction, for entertainment, and for schooling. Well, that that gave Nephilim hosts an opportunity to gather AI data on our children to hoodwink them. And it was at that point in time, Jesus was beginning to show me that we have an entire generation, not just children, but adults who have been hoodwinked. And so it's time to set the captives free. Well, when The Roots of the Federal Reserve was published in November of that year, the Lord began asking me to walk in Ephesians 5:11, which says, "Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them." And that's because, we have the father of lies has been crafting these narratives that have hoodwinked us to believe these false pretenses and warped philosophies. And it makes me think about 2 Timothy 4:3-4, which says, "For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths." And I think we are living in such a time as this, where biblical morals have been whittled down to make way for the rise of debauchery and every form of wickedness, as in the days of Noah. So in Generation Hoodwink, what I do is I uncover the myriad of ways that the Nephilim agenda has been strangling the lifeblood out of humanity. And what I do is it really provides kind of this pathway out of the dark caverns of mind control by exposing the fruitless deeds of darkness. So what I do is I shine a light on these deceptive narratives that have been thrust upon us. And the Lord is using it as a call to freedom, because he wants us to be able to declare with confidence that we are a generation that is no longer enslaved. And so that's what led me to write Generation Hoodwinked. And some of what I'll talk about today is in my book, and that is, I'll end by sharing about how we can step into the dominion authority that Christ restored for us. So anyways, that's a little bit of what I'm up to, where people can reach me. But I thought I would dive into, like I said, the importance of rest and what we gain when we can embrace rest. Now, first of all, I think true worship is only possible if we know how to truly rest, because rest requires us to gaze at the goodness of the Father. And so, I think about so many of us, myself included, we've said things like, "Man, if I had more time," right? If I had more time, I could do X, Y, and Z. And I started to think about that statement, because if we had more time, knowing us, we would just fill it with more things to do, right?
Right.
So the problem is not that we don't have enough time. I think the problem is that we have lost sight of the ancient wisdom that's rooted in rest. And so that's why I wanted to speak about rest today. And, Sabbath, when we think about the Sabbath, it is a gift from the Creator because it prolongs our life. It brings us sanity and wholeness. It also enriches our relationships and it increases our fruitfulness. Now, I want to highlight the fact that Sabbath is not what we do once we've completed all our tasks. We rest right in the middle of all our tasks, and we rest with without excuse and without guilt. And that's because we want to enter into that rest. It's what God told us to do from the very beginning. And we see this in Genesis 2, verse 2 through 3. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So one of the things I love to do is I love to dig into the etymology of words. And if you look at the Hebrew word for rest in this passage, it's Shabbath. And that's the root word for Sabbath. Well, check out what it means. It means to cease, desist, rest, to put an end to exterminate, to destroy, and to remove. So this is hinting at voluntary rest. But it also means to cause to cease, to cause to desist, to cause to fail, to make one rest, be still, and to take away. And that speaks to involuntary rest. Now, in looking at, this definition, I started to wonder, like, how can the word for rest also mean to destroy and exterminate? Like, what does that have to do with Sabbath? And then the Lord helped me realize that when we rest, we are also warring, because we are destroying the works of the enemy. We're putting an end to striving, to worry, anxiety, pride, and self-sufficiency. Now, with this definition, it shows us that we can either enter into rest voluntarily or involuntarily. And one of the important things to recognize is that the Sabbath, this rest, is a commandment. It's the fourth commandment, and this comes from Exodus 20, verse 8 through 11, which says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Well, so this passage shows us that the principle of Sabbath, it's not just for his children, it's for all of humanity, both slave and free, Jew and Gentile. It's also for all of creation. So it's not just for people. Animals need rest. The land needs rest. In fact, Exodus 23, 10 through 11 tells us, "For 6 years you were to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the seventh year, let the land lie unplowed and unused." Well, the Lord took very seriously this commandment to allow the land to rest. And when his children neglected to give the land rest, he drove them into captivity. In fact, that's what the Babylonian captivity was all about. They were in captivity for the number of years they did not honor the Shemitah, which is the Sabbath year for the land. Now, when we honor the Sabbath, what happens is it causes us to trust in the Lord for our provisions and to take care of our needs. It moves us from a place of trying to meet our own needs to depending on the Lord. And I love Matthew 6:8, the second half of that passage says the Father knows what we need even before we ask him. And he knows us inside and out. He knows us and what we need better than we know ourselves. So when we follow his lead, he will lead us into rest. But unfortunately, so many of us like to have control on our own schedules. We're dictated by what our calendar tells us. And so to enter into rest means that we're going to fully surrender to the Lord on a daily basis. And one of the things the Lord challenged me with a couple years back is I began praying and asking him to order my day. So I wanted him to orchestrate my day rather than what my calendar says. And so I try to each and every day say, "Lord, order my day." And it's so much fun seeing what the Holy Spirit has in store for my day rather than what I think I'm going to do in any given day. And there are some days, where I have a packed schedule and the Holy Spirit knows that I need to rest. And one by one, people on my calendar on that schedule will cancel for whatever reason, different reasons. And before long, my whole day is freed up. I love days like that because I know that the Lord has this gem of rest for me. And so I want to enter into that. Now, I mentioned earlier that we can either enter rest voluntarily or involuntarily. Now, when we enter rest voluntarily, it means that we're choosing to cease, to stop, to rely on the Lord for his provisions. But when we enter into rest involuntarily, it means that something or someone causes us to rest. We may work ourselves so hard that we develop sickness or injury, or we may get laid off from our job, for example. These circumstances, they force us to rest, but we still have a choice in that. Are we going to enter into rest in the midst of difficult situations, or do we get ourselves so emotionally worked up because of worry or anger or fear that we're not able to enter into rest? And I've done it both ways, and I would much rather choose to enter into rest, because when involuntary rest is brought upon me, it's prolonged injury or prolonged sickness. And, throughout my life, the Lord has been really teaching me to rest, because I used to really strive. And I'm getting better for sure at rest. But the Lord will, keep bringing me back to this concept of how important it is to rest. And, one of my top strengths there's a strength finder test. And one of my top strengths is achiever. So I'm constantly doing things, right? I've always got these projects I'm working on, or I'm writing, or I'm doing interviews, or I'm researching something. And, sometimes my husband will tease me. He's like, do you have this running list of to-dos in your head? And it's totally true. I do, for sure. And I used to be the kind of person that would go, just keep going until I collapsed. And that's because I was always striving after something. Well, striving can get really ugly. And, I realized, thankfully, the Lord has broken that in me. But I had to go back to the origin. What was the origin point of striving in my life? And I was a competitive figure skater. Fun fact. When I was from
Wait
the
a
age of
minute.
6.
Wait, I'm trying to picture that. I had no idea. How long did you do that for?
From age 6 to age 13.
How?
And so I'm a natural athlete, so it came fairly easy. I worked really hard, but I did really well. So I finished first, second, or third in every competition except for the last 2 competitions. And I was getting to that point where I was deciding, am I going to train for the Olympics and not go to school, just train full time, or not? Well, my very last competition, I was super well trained. Like I could do my program without a flaw. But when it came time for the competition and my program, I went on the ice and the nerves got the best of me, and I fell on one of my jumps. And so I ended my program and I skated off the ice with my head held down. And that's like number one rule you don't ever do as a figure skater, because it's the last thing the judges see. So if you're disappointed with your own performance, of course, that will encourage the judges to mark you down. Well, I get off the ice and my coach yells at me in front of hundreds of people. And then my parents give me the silent treatment. And so what I noticed, or what I learned from that, is when I fail, I'm going to be rejected. And so I made this inner vow, kind of an unconscious pact, that I'm never going to allow myself to fail. So I pushed myself and I entered into that striving mentality. Well, that is exhausting. And so the Lord had to, in order to break me from that, because I wouldn't often enter into rest, He brought involuntary rest and, different things throughout my life, knee injuries that took way longer to heal after a surgery, those types of things. Well, when I choose to enter into rest, it's such a beautiful process, because you learn these truths and you get to see aspects of God's character in new ways. And it really breaks the back of striving. And Matthew 11:28-30 says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So if we think about striving, there's a yoke of striving, but there's also a yoke of rest. And Jesus offers himself as our place of rest. Well, when I discovered that there's a place of rest, it's in the bosom of Jesus, I realized I can live my life in this place of rest. I can war from a place of rest. I can be productive from a place of rest. And a few years back, the Lord told me, Jesus said, the enemy can't even find you when you're hidden in my presence. And so when you think about that, his presence is filled with glory and it blinds the enemy. So if I'm hidden in his presence, that's why the enemy can't find me. And then he gave me an image of myself like this baby bird under the wings, the shadow of his wings. I've got my mouth open and he's feeding me and I'm just, constantly wanting to be fed by him. But then when he sends me on assignment, I'm like that peregrine falcon. And so I dive at top speed and I strike the mark. But then as soon as I hit the mark, I return back to the nest and I'm that baby bird again under the shadow of his wings. And that's the beauty of learning to live in the place of rest that Jesus has for us. Now, I mentioned I'm one of those natural athletes. As I've gotten older, my different sports that I'm involved in have changed. My new favorite is paddleboarding. And so the Lord has taught me some really cool lessons about, as I've been on my paddleboard, about the difference between striving and rest. So there are times where I'm out on the lake and it's windy. Now, when you're paddling into the wind, everything is harder, right? It's my board is like slapping up and down against the waves. It's harder to paddle, harder to go anywhere, harder to stay on your board. Well, the Lord gave me this image as the image of what the yoke of striving looks like. When we are striving, everything is more difficult. When we have that heavy yoke of striving on us, it's harder to accomplish things. And even when we're trying to accomplish the thing we're set out to do, and we reach those difficult moments where it's hard, because of that bondage of striving, we'll just buckle down and try harder. Well, what happens oftentimes is, we can feel stressed, we get irritable, we get angry, we can be filled with anxiety. But the moment that we enter into rest, it's like that moment where I get to turn my board around and go with the wind. And everything is easier. And in fact, I don't even have to paddle. I could just stand on my board and with minimal steering, I can get to where I want to go. But if I decide to paddle, I go farther, faster with way less effort. And to me, this is an example of the yoke of rest. One other example that comes to mind when I was out paddleboarding, again, another windy day. When it's windy, it's hard. It's not peaceful. I love going out when it's glassy because then I can see the fish and the frogs and the turtles and I just have a great time. But when it's windy, it just is hard. It's all the way around hard. So one time I'm out there, I'm paddling, it's windy. I've got a long ways to go because I don't choose to go out in heavy winds. Here in Utah, the weather changes every 5 minutes sometimes. And so you could be out there and then all of a sudden these strong winds come up. So I'm out there, I'm paddling into the wind. It's hard. But then all of a sudden I get lost in his presence. And so my body is still on the board. I'm still paddling, but I lose track of time. I lose track of how difficult it is because my soul and spirit are soaring in the presence of God.
Can we stop there for just a second? I lose track of how hard it is.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the beauty of entering into rest. See, in that moment, Jesus was showing me that we can live in rest no matter how difficult the situations are. And I think David is an incredible example to us. He had to find rest in the midst of difficult circumstances. And for David, it was about surrendering to the sovereignty of the Lord. In Psalm 62, it actually gives us a window of how David lived this out. And this is verse 1 through 5. It says, "My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. How long will you assault a man? Would all of you throw him down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? They fully intend to topple him from his lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him." So here, David was surrounded by these enemies that were bent on his destruction. And in verse 1, he's declaring that his soul finds rest in God alone. But by verse 5, he is telling his soul to find rest in God alone. And so it makes me realize that, David is probably experiencing fear and worry and despair in the middle from verse 1 to verse 5. And he gets to a point where he has to take every thought captive and command his soul to enter into rest. See, David, he needed to know that God was his rock, his fortress, and his salvation in order to be able to endure the difficult circumstances. And I think, sometimes we have to tell our souls to find rest in God alone. And, we have to remind ourselves that he works together for good, in all situations for those who are called according to his purpose. And so I have found, as I enter into that place of rest, not only do I get to see aspects of God's character that I don't see in other ways, but also he teaches me how he's designed me. And that allows me to more fully walk in my spiritual gifts. So that's the beauty of rest.
I am gobsmacked right now on so many levels. But one of the things that you just helped me to better articulate with women I talk with is we talk about, there's the verse that says, love your neighbor as yourself. And so many women were nurturers biologically, right? Most of us are. But I find that Christian women, especially, I don't know, in my generation, I'm a Gen Xer. And I don't want to put people in a box, but we struggle with taking care of ourselves, finding rest. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. So it's assuming that you're taking really good care of yourself and is saying that you should love others that way. Mm-hmm. And so what I wrote down here, so many things I wrote down. I saw Jen taking notes too, is rest breaks striving. And you said when we rest, we're entering into spiritual warfare. And women really do we struggle with this because we're enslaved? Do we struggle with this because we're deceived? The concept of rest to a lot of women, humans, feels selfish. Can you speak to that real quick?
Yeah. And that's why I said in the beginning, we rest without excuse. We rest without guilt. For a while, for me to be able to enter into rest, I felt like I had to earn the rest.
Yes.
I had to work really hard and get to a place where I earned to take a day off.
Like we deserve it.
Right. But it's not. It's how the Father designed all of creation. So in order to live a healthy life, we have to follow the patterns he established at the beginning of creation. And that is all things need to rest. And so now I take a Sabbath every week. And, it used to be hard for me because, I would think, oh my gosh, I've got to get this done before, if I had a deadline, for example, and I didn't have enough time to prepare for that deadline, it would be even harder to take that Sabbath day. But that's where trusting in the Father, trusting in the Lord for his goodness and that he knows what I need. And what I have learned is when I surrender my time to him, he allows me actually at times to operate outside of time, meaning I will be able to accomplish things that would not have been possible for me to accomplish in a short amount of time. So when I trust in him with my time, then he multiplies it.
That is so good. Rest breaks striving. I'm curious if you could tell us, for someone who is not familiar with the concept of Sabbath, what does that mean to you? What does that mean as far as boundaries or personal limits you set or things that you honor? How do you spend your Sabbath day?
I think the Lord is helping me define it more and more. So it's a bit of a work in progress. Where I'm at this point is once a week, I will take a day of rest, which means I don't work. I don't do anything related to my ministry or writing or any of that. So I take a break from that. I don't always do it from Friday night to Saturday night, which would be the Sabbath according to the Hebrew calendar. But I do once a week take a Sabbath, and generally it's either from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown or from Saturday sundown to Sunday sundown. It just depends on the needs of my family. And I look forward to the Sabbath. Absolutely look forward to it. Not
How
only
do,
because I get to rest, but also because I get to watch how God is going to allow me to get things done that I think I need to get done.
okay, so between the time of striving and resting,
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that because you're human, um, that there was a transition period, because just recently Dan had texted me while I was at work, and he's like, if you had like $3,000, what would you do today? And I literally couldn't think of anything that I would do. I am absolutely convinced that I don't know how to rest. It's probably why I've been sick for about 6 weeks. But for many of us, resting isn't very restful, because there's a transition. And when I say resting, I use quotes for that, because there is a transition between striving and resting. How do we get there? How do we get to the place, like for you, resting? Would that have been going, out on the lake? But then you would have been like coming up with all these spiritual analogies and stuff like that God is teaching you. Is that resting? Does that count? What counts as resting when you haven't really learned the skill to do that yet?
I can share with you a little bit of my process of how I came into living in a place of rest. So it actually happened in the month of December, probably in 2014, I want to say. Um, and I realized the heavy yoke of striving that I was under in the month, particularly in the month of December, with the holidays, with all the preparations, with the gift buying, the gift wrapping, the gift giving, the meals, the parties, all of that. And I just was like, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I'm done with Christmas. I'm so fed up with it. I don't like the expectations that are placed on people. And so I realized, here in Utah, sometimes it will snow in Salt Lake Valley in December. And it happened to be snowing on a particular day. And I looked outside and I was like, when it snows, there's a quietness, there's a hush that happens in nature. It dampens the sounds. And so everything
Mm-hmm.
is quieter. And I realized that I was out of rhythm with the rhythms that God established in the seasons. That in wintertime, there's a time where it's quieter, a time to be more reflective, a time to come into his presence in the stillness and the quietness. And that was contrasted with what culture tells us to do in the month of December. And so it was then that I realized this juxtaposition, and I didn't want to be in the rhythm of culture. I wanted to get in the rhythm with God's times and seasons. And so that's how it started for me. And from there is when I learned that there's actually a place of rest, and it's in the presence of Jesus. And so I try and live from that place. Now, sometimes I will get stressed for sure, but it is few and far between now versus before, I would get myself so worked up about what felt like now the smallest of things. And when it really was tested was when my daughter graduated from high school in 2016. And we had a ton of family coming into town. I was hosting. I'm not the best host. It is not my skill set. My mother is incredible. It like skipped over me. um, and so I realized, okay, I have an opportunity to do all this hosting, do all the things that go with a high school graduation from a place of rest. And it was transformative for me. I recognized the difference. And so I'm sure at times I've gone back, but not to the level I used to. I try now and live from that place of rest. So then actually doing a Sabbath once a week is a lot easier. I still have an internal struggle though, because again, one of my strengths is achiever. So I've got all these projects I want to work on, but I take a step back from those and just rest. So
does your brain actually shut off?
No, not really. No. And that's a kind of a family joke. My mind is constantly going.
Yeah.
But I've also learned how to be still and quiet in the presence of the Lord. And I call those my times of listening. So I'll come before the Lord. And this doesn't necessarily happen on the Sabbath. I do this, whenever I feel a nudge to do it. Sometimes he'll wake me up in the middle of the night and I get up and I have times of listening. So I come before him without any agenda. I don't have my Bible, don't have my journal. I just simply sit at his feet. And learning how to sit at his feet in that stillness and quietness, that's when he begins talking to me and I have the ears to hear.
Thank you for sharing. That's so relatable. That verse, be still and know that I am God, haunted me, tortured me for so long because I did not realize that I was running from pain and running from things I needed to press into. And once I did that, once I allowed God to heal those wounds and even that family of origin baggage and all of that, being still and knowing He is God became a strength. Dr. Laura, you've mentioned that your mother has the gift of hospitality, and we talked about your gift of teaching and wisdom and knowledge in the beginning. And we were talking pre-roll a little bit about motivational or redemptive gifts in Romans 12. I know you have some things to teach us on that. Let's go there.
I'm so excited to share this because redemptive gifts, understanding these Romans 12 gifts, they really made my life make sense. So I have to credit Arthur Burke because he came to our church back in the early 2000s and he taught us about redemptive gifts. And he's done a tremendous amount of work on a number of things, but redemptive gifts is one of them. So I took copious notes from what he taught. And I have learned to apply it, and it has really helped relationships as well, especially with family members, because when you understand your children's redemptive gifts or your spouse's redemptive gifts, as well as your own, it really helps you in communicating with one another. So let me read, first of all, from Romans 12. This is verse 6 through 8. It says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Now, okay, so there's 7 gifts here, and they're either referred to as redemptive gifts or motivational gifts. And these are different than the spiritual gifts given to us by the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians 12. They're also different from the Ephesians 4 gifts. Those are the 5-fold gifts, and those are given to us by Jesus. These Romans 12 gifts are given to us by the Father. They're knit, when we are being knit in our mother's womb, these redemptive gifts are given to us at the point of conception. So it's not at the point of salvation, and that helps differentiate these gifts. And so the redemptive gifts, they define who we are, our personality, our outlook, the way that we see ministry, the way that we do life. Also, woundedness will significantly impact how these gifts are carried out. So what I want to do is, there's 7 of them. I want to go through each 7 and give some behavioral characteristics of each of these gifts. And so your listeners can, glean from this perhaps what some of their redemptive gifts are.
We love it. Sounds great.
So I'll start with prophecy. Now, that's the first gift mentioned. Arthur Burke calls this perceiver, and it's a little bit easier to understand when you think about someone who is a perceiver. They may prophesy, but not necessarily. And these are people who have black or white thinking. They can easily see right from wrong. They often will take initiative because they like doing new things, but they're not the greatest at maintaining something. These people are verbally expressive. They have opinions about a lot of things. And oftentimes they can judge things or people because they can easily see right from wrong. They'll also process things quickly. Now, these are people who are bold. They often are fearless. They do not tolerate bondage. They don't like being put in a box, so they will fight against that. Perceivers can be extraordinarily generous. In fact, many times they'll outgive givers. But what differentiates the perceivers' giving is that they can impulsively give without thinking all the way through it, whereas the givers are very prudent in how they give. Now, perceivers, they are visionary people. They need vision. They need to understand the purpose for what they're doing in life. That ignites them. They can be fiercely competitive. Winning is everything to them. They can beat themselves up too for doing things that are wrong. And they often want to make sense out of things that's important to them. Now, perceivers, they understand the mind of God as much as a human can. But they relate more to the mind of God. And so they want to make sense out of things. And a sign of maturity in this gift is that they can recognize the sovereignty of God. So they can't always figure things out. But a perceiver will hold on to truth as more valuable than relationships. So they can move on from relationships and they can be out of sight, out of mind, because truth is much more valuable to them. They have a passion for excellence, both for themselves and also for those around them. And as I mentioned, perceivers, they're very expressive and they have the full range of emotions. My oldest son is a perceiver. And so we see the full range from total excitement to full out anger and rage at times. So you get the whole gamut. And the way Arthur Burke, an analogy he gives is it's like a piano that has 88 keys versus a violin that has 24 notes. So the perceiver, full range of emotions. The perceiver also can identify easily the principles of God. So that's a perceiver. Now, a servant are those, they can see the needs in a situation or the needs that a person has, and they are quick to meet those needs. They will put things aside to go meet the need. That's what's important to them. Now, sometimes they can be taken advantage of and exploited by others because they have difficulty in saying no. So in some people that are servants, they can develop kind of this victim spirit. Also, they sometimes have difficulty receiving affirmation from others. But servants, they do not have enemies. Everyone likes a servant, and they can see the good in others and they'll honor others, which is a beautiful thing. They also have this fierce anger when someone has done something to a family member or a close friend. And so they are intensely loyal. They also tend to be people who save stuff. They save lots of things and not particularly in an organized manner. And sometimes they can't find it. But one thing about servants is they are hard workers. It's a high value of theirs. Now, their downfall might be that they enable others. So they may be the one to always step in and do something without scaling back and giving other people the opportunity to serve. Now, a wise servant will learn how to empower rather than enable. And then sometimes the servants can be dishonored in their home, and they can walk in denial with regards to their kids. So if you have two parents that are servants, what happens is their kids can grow up being spoiled because the parents are always doing the serving and not training up their children to serve. But what I love about servants is their motives are pure and they are honest people. They are trustworthy people, and they prefer to be behind the scenes. They don't want to be in the spotlight. So those are servants. And then there's the teacher gift. This is one of my redemptive gifts are teacher and mercy. So a teacher validates truth, and accuracy is vital. Oftentimes you'll find a teacher involved in research. They love research. They also like things to be line upon line. So they'll connect the dots that help people understand. Teachers make decisions slowly, especially, in new realms, because they have to process things. Typically, they're safe people emotionally. Teachers can listen to brokenness without having a judgmental attitude. They have a deep family loyalty. Teachers can be poor at returning things. So if you give a teacher a book, or can be poor at returning phone calls. They can be late to appointments and also have difficulty handling money. Oftentimes, teachers will be unwilling to engage in a process unless they can see the end of the process. So this is where there's a rub with teachers, and oftentimes the Lord has to teach them and challenge their faith, because they can get stymied and not engage in something if they don't understand the process and see the end of it. Also, teachers that are immature can be some of the most self-centered people. In a group, they tend to be the last ones to speak because they want to listen to what others have to say, and then they offer their perspective that will bring clarity. Teachers also are not easily swayed from the truth. And then they have an ability to apply biblical principles from one situation to another. And even though, the specifics aren't spelled out, they can take that biblical principle and, like I said, apply it to many different situations. So that's a teacher. Now, an encourager. Encouragers, they are a party ready to happen. They This is Chris, apparently. They don't know a stranger. In a matter of minutes, they can become best friends with somebody. It's like they can discover the key that unlocks people, and they can relate across genders, across cultures, across spiritual lines, and they don't have enemies either. Everybody likes encouragers. You always want an encourager around because it makes you feel good, right? And encouragers can be some of the best at evangelism as well. And they can have significant disagreements without straining relationships. Now, the beautiful thing about encouragers is they are master communicators, and they're skilled at being able to maintain relationships. And they don't like being alone. So they're energized when they're with people. They also can be very flexible, spontaneous, and they're not intimidated by change. They can be visionary like the perceiver, and that's because they can see the broader perspective. Typically, encouragers will govern decisions, like make decisions, by thinking about relationships and persuasion, not necessarily by principles like the perceiver. They also tend to be more in tune to the feelings of others, and they can understand the timing of how people will receive things. Encouragers, they will mobilize, network, and inspire people, and they're often called to interface with vast numbers of people. So those are encouragers. Then the givers generally, they have this generational worldview. that is really a hallmark of the gift. So they're intentionally preparing the way for their family after them. So they do things in their lives with their children and grandchildren in mind. Givers have a spirit of nurture. They create a family environment where families get along with each other. They're also very independent. So God designed them to not be needy. They don't often look to other people for help. God designed them to be able to see a problem and then look for the solution. Givers cannot be hustled. They cannot be manipulated to give. They give when they're ready to give. And they can relate to a wide range of people, but they tend to be very private in their own lives. And spiritual warfare is often something they delegate to others. It's not their go-to. Now, givers give wisely. And so oftentimes they don't want to give to startup companies or startup ministries. They want to see a return on their investment. So they'll look at the track record of a business or a ministry when deciding to give. And then typically they can be frugal at home with their family, even though they can give generously. Then a leader, this is easy to spot. A leader, can take a vision and break it down and implement it. They tend to have administrative skills. They love being under a great deal of pressure. In fact, they thrive under pressure. And it's hard for them to enter into rest for any length of time. On vacation, a leader will rest for a little bit, but then they'll fill their schedule with all sorts of things that they want to do on vacation. Well, it's important for them to have people around them that are under pressure as well. And this works most effectively when there's a short duration and everyone is working on completing a task. And they don't really need the affirmation of others. Leaders don't care what other people think. They just need the affirmation and validation from God in the decisions that they make. Now, they are good at motivating people to push them to get a task done. And that's, they're also skilled at time management. Well, for leaders, loyalty is extremely important. So they'll look to loyalty and relationship over competence. And one of the things that is amazing about leaders is they have this ability to use imperfect people and position them in just the right position or task to pull out the best in them. Leaders will often look at something and they'll figure out how they can build onto that and make it even better. And they typically will not volunteer. If you want a leader to help you, you've got to ask a leader because they need to know that they're wanted. And they often can be very task oriented. And so that makes them fall short in the nurturing department. And then finally, mercy. That's one of my other redemptive gifts. Mercy, they rarely have enemies as well. They're a safe person to be around for especially those that are wounded. And people will often come up to them and just bare their souls, even if they don't know the person that well. And that's because mercy it's like we have this radar for people who are wounded and rejected. We can walk into a room and pretty quickly tell who's wounded. Mercy people, they have many acquaintances, but only a few intimate friends. And those intimate friends, they are completely transparent with. And that's because intimacy is very important for the mercy people, both body, soul, and spirit. So touch is important to them. They can develop that intimate relationship with the Lord. They may be slow to make transitions or make decisions because they process things emotionally very slowly. When they hear from God, it's difficult for them to explain the why. And that's because the mercy feels the heart of God. Perceiver understands the mind of God. Mercy understands the heart of God. And so it's beautiful when you have a perceiver and mercy working together because you have both the heart and mind of God represented. Mercy people, they operate on subjective and intuitive senses, and they hate to confront others because they're built more to be protective and nurturing. Mercy also can be fiercely defensive. They can be like a mama bear. If somebody has hurt a family member, the mercy can intensely defend them. They also tend to be able to enter into worship and enter into the presence of God more easily than the other gifts. And that's because their heart and soul, they're wired just to be and not to do. So this would be Mary's instead of Martha's. And then with a mercy person, they can bring holiness and sanctification to people, to land, even to buildings and to timelines. And if they cultivate an intimate relationship with Jesus, then they build up that virtue and it flows out of them to bring holiness to something that was defiled. So it changes defilement into holiness. So those are the redemptive gifts. And I think, once we understand our redemptive gifts, we can flow in them more freely and we can recognize, that there's purpose in how God designed us. And that really helps us step into our identity and be able to walk in that dominion authority that Jesus reclaimed for us.
You just talked about stepping into that identity and dominion authority. And when you and I first started talking over a year ago via email, I remember sending you a question where I said, Dr. Laura, I don't have the words to describe or articulate to women about how they can step into their authority. They're lacking identity. And you and I were trying to noodle out how to communicate that to people. And I love that God just brought that conversation full circle because with these redemptive gifts, that does that. This does that. It helps us to step into our identity and into our authority.
What does it mean to walk in dominion authority?
Well, I think, as we understand what our redemptive gifts are, then it helps us to understand how we're wired, but then also this dominion authority that Christ, he restored to us. So let me kind of walk us through a little bit of what happened with dominion authority. And it actually comes from Genesis 1:28. It says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" Well, so when God established dominion authority, it was a principle of great importance. It actually distinguishes humanity from the rest of creation. Now, when we look at the Hebrew word for dominion, it's radah, and it means to rule, have dominion, dominate, tread down, and prevail against. Well, I love this because when we grasp this, we recognize that we are victors, not victims. And that's what I think, back to one of the encouragements you were giving, Jen, is how do we take all of these things that maybe in this season, for example, December, can be very difficult with the holidays. People experience great loss in the holidays. Some people are alone during the holidays. Some people are stressed out because of all the expectations. Well, not only do we want to enter into rest, but we want to recognize that we have dominion authority. And so, this definition that we will have dominion, will tread down, will prevail against, it actually helps us recognize that we're going to face resistance. And we face resistance from our adversary, who would like nothing more than to see us fail in being faithful stewards. Now, we need to learn how to prevail against our adversary. And I think, when you think about how God established the earth, I think it's truly remarkable that the maker of heaven and earth gave humanity the responsibility to govern his creation. And so when Adam and Eve, they were given this dominion authority, Lucifer was seething with jealousy because he once had high levels of authority. He was created as this beautiful, magnificent spiritual being, and he was to produce this amazing music. But he became enamored with himself, right? He gave himself over to pride. He wanted to outshine the glory of the Holy One. And so Lucifer, he wanted to ascend to the heights, but his punishment was an eviction notice given to him by Almighty Elohim. So he was stripped of his authority and he was thrown out of heaven. Now, even though Satan lost his authority, he still maintained a measure of power. And when you think about the order of creation, God granted humans free will. So Adam and Eve were free to do what they chose with this dominion authority that God had given them. And unfortunately, they chose wrong. Well, the father took a great risk in giving his children free will, but the alternative certainly was unbearable. He didn't want a race of automatons. Well, we see that Satan, he devised this scheme to commandeer the authority that was given to Adam and Eve. And so he tricked Earth's first governors into thinking that if they ate the fruit from the tree, the forbidden tree, then they would gain more power and more wisdom. Well, Adam and Eve fell right into the trap, and their desire for power actually caused them to walk in rebellion. And they relinquished their God-given dominion authority to the enemy of us all, Satan. And so Earth's first governors put all of humanity under the rule of Satan, who's called the prince of the power of the air. Well, thankfully, even though it seemed like humanity was doomed for destruction, thankfully the Father had a grand rescue plan, and that was through Jesus. Jesus came and restored everything that was lost on that fateful day in the garden. So the first Adam, he squandered his ability, his authority to govern the kingdoms of this world. But the second Adam, Jesus, he came and he reordered God's government on earth. And, when you think about the price that Jesus had to pay for one bite of fruit, it's almost beyond human comprehension, because he had to face the accuser, he had to face temptation, false accusations, rejection, the weight of sin on him, and then a death that was reserved for criminals. And I think about, if Adam and Eve would have known all that was necessary to pay the debt for their rebellion, I wonder if they would have chosen differently. And so it makes us realize that, not only did Jesus restore this, but he himself, he overcame temptation. He could have walked in rebellion and not done what the Father's will was, but thankfully he didn't. And he surrendered himself to the Father's will. And because of that, we have a living hope in Jesus. And that's what I think is so vital for this season, is that no matter what we face, no matter how difficult the holiday season may be, we have a living hope that means we're never without hope, no matter how difficult things become. And I think it's critical to understand that when Jesus restored this dominion authority through his life, death, and resurrection, when he ascended to the Father, he put the responsibility of governing on our shoulders, and he gave us the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 16:19 says, "For I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Well, I think we're living in these critical moments in time where we have to exercise our dominion authority. We do not have to be victims. We are victors. Jesus already won the seed war. So when we enter into this time of rest, like I encourage us to in the beginning, when we learn to live in the presence of the Lord, we can face difficult situations with peace and with rest. And then that allows us to be able to hear the Lord more clearly. We can see how he's designed us to be. Then when we walk in the fullness of our redemptive gifts, we then can walk also in that dominion authority. So no weapon formed against us will prosper. And that's what I wanted to encourage people with, because even though we are living in dark times, I think we're living in the best of times as well, because our light shines so brightly in the darkness.
Amen. I have no follow-up for that. Just yes and amen. Wow. Jen, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but I just want to say, Dr. Laura, thank you for being here today and for sharing this. I've listened multiple times to your first episode on our podcast, and I know this is going to be one that I listen to over and over and over again, because there is such rich truth, and it's not complicated. It's not hard. It's very simple.
Thank you so
That's
much.
beautiful.
I appreciate you so very much.
All right. Well, on that note, listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Betrayal Recovery Transformation Podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion, insightful, understatement, much, and empowering. If you enjoyed this episode, we just would love for you to subscribe, rate, and leave a review for us. It really helps our listeners find the help and healing that they deserve and need. And your support means so much to Jen and I. Until next time, be kind to yourself, keep pursuing healing. Would totally encourage you all to read Romans 12 for yourself, identify your spiritual gifts if you have not done that yet. It is such an empowering thing to do, and dive in there. And on a last note, Merry Christmas. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Betrayal Recovery Transformation Podcast with your hosts, Chris Rocha and Jen Howie. We hope you've been helped and encouraged. If you value the content we shared today, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps others find the show. Need personalized guidance? Please contact Chris or Jen for transformative coaching. This episode has been brought to you by HealingWithTheHowies.com, WatermarkCoach.com, and with the support of Pure Life Alliance Ministries.